Okay, I'll just talk to you about our project, Rising Powers, Labour Standards and the Governance of Global Production Networks. We start with the premise that there is now a growing recognition, growing debate that labour standards and standards more generally matter to international trade and matter to the ways in which global production systems are organised and structured and governed. And you see this in various particular manifestations. You see this in work around codes of conduct, around corporate social responsibility, around the emergence of sector-wide codes for particular sectoral programs, and also the ways in which NGOs and other bodies from within civil society have been incorporated into the process of rule-making around standards, and partly again linked to, in a sense, the retreat of the state under the neoliberal era. You also see a great deal of engagement around standards, not at the multilateral level of policy, trade policy formation, but particularly around the bilateral arena through various initiatives in the US and in the EU, where particularly in the EU, for example, it's now mandated that you have to have a labour clause in any bilateral agreement that the EU now signs with any partner. So there's this overarching debate around labour standards and how they factor into these questions around trade policy. And within that, there's questions about what does this then say for the governance of global production arrangements? How are global value chains organized when you have to take those issues around standards on board? What is the nature of this kind of public and private regulation and enforcement? How does that work? How is that negotiated? And how do we see standards more generally kind of shaping trade policy discourses? That's the kind of context in which we came into this project. And for us, the question is really about what happens when production is not only moving to these rising powers. These are not only the factories of the world, as it were, or the places from where we're sourcing much of our commodities. They're also the ones which are now engaged in driving those production arrangements. They're the lead firms are coming out of those economies, and there's a growing middle-class consumer markets within them. So there are questions both around what does this say from the supply side, what does this say from the demand side, as to how rising powers, and in particular differentiating between public and private actors within rising powers, might affect the governance of labour standards in production. That's what our core agenda is about. And we're seeing that through the question of rules of the games. We really want to understand, how do these three countries that we're particularly interested in, China, India, and Brazil, how do they change, how do they alter, how do they cause flux, as it were, in the rules of the game that govern labour standards in production? There is an emerging kind of and quite strong populist discourse that there is going to be a race to the bottom, that consumers in these parts of the world do not care about these sorts of consideration, that firms from these economies are pushing standards down, and we want to really open that question up. And in our mind, that is a problematic position to begin with. And what we see is a much more differentiated terrain of standards. And in particular, we want to kind of open that question into thinking about to what extent do these economies and do particular kinds of actors in these economies move from being standard takers to standard makers. And what can we also learn from comparative analysis? So we're putting a lot of emphasis in trying to understand how does that work in three very different kinds of state and institutional frameworks. So our research focus is really around linking what we have there in the Venn diagram, research on firms, looking at emerging power lead firms and small firm clusters, research on civil society actors, and again, civil society is a complex term, and how does one use civil society and define civil society in the Chinese context is very different from ones, say, in India or Brazil, where you have a long history of civil society institutional engagement. So how do we unpackage that? But again, getting a sense of how does that shape that debate? And then coming back to the question of the state. So the state isn't in our title, but the state is very much part of our agenda. And we're looking at the state both at the ways in which regulatory frameworks are being shaped around labour standards in these countries and being enforced, as well as the way in which the state from these countries exercise their positions around debates on labour standard formulation in the international arenas where these discourses take place. So we're spending some time looking at this in the context of debates within the ILO, within the WTO, within the International Standards Organization, and also within the European Union. And our final question is, well, what are the consequences of all of this? What does it say then for not just rising power firms and their engagement around standards, but also for OECD players? And what does it say for the ways in which we see trajectories on standards evolving? Are we going to move away from a notion of universal standards to much more differentiated concepts of standards, and what arises from that? How are we doing this? We're one of the late starters. We started our project in April 2013. We had a 3-year project. It's been extended by 6 months because of my taking on the position of being the coordinator. So we have a program of work. We have not started our primary field researches yet. We've been doing a series of scoping studies in each of the 3 countries, trying to get our position understood about how these processes are evolving. Disciplinarily, we come at it from 2 different angles. We're drawing on work from development studies, which has really looked at these questions around global production networks, or economic geography in particular, around global production networks and global value chains. But we're also trying to draw in work from business studies, which has been very rich in terms of analysis of emerging power multinationals. So we're trying to pull those 2 together. And our work is now also looking into not just China, India, and Brazil, but also in the international institutions. So we're spending a bit of time, as I said, on organizations like WTO, ILO, and the EU here in Europe. We have a medium-sized team, I would say, not one of the largest, not one of the smallest, but we have co-investigators in Rudolf Sinkovich, who's leading the lead firm work here out of Manchester. We have a co-investigator in Peter Noringa, who's based at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, who's leading the work around civil society. And then we have colleagues in Brazil, in China, and India who are handling the country component of the work as co-investigators. We also have 2 PhD students linked to the project directly with PhD projects around these agendas. And we have, like some others have been doing, I mean, Brian was talking about in his context of his project, we've also got a kind of a growing number of colleagues who are involved in the project but were not initially formally part of the project as team members, but who are increasingly taking on components of work that is becoming particularly interesting to us, things that have kind of emerged since we formulated the proposal. So, for example, Louise Curran at the Toulouse Business School and Sangeeta Khurana at Keele University are doing a small component of work for us around the ways in which the European Union and India are negotiating a bilateral trade agreement and are not being able to come to a common consensus on this. And part of that is about the politics of it. I mean, there is elections taking place in India, and until the elections are resolved, things won't move forward, but there are also elections in the European Union, and until the European Union Parliament comes together, we won't see it. But underlying it is a question which is very fundamental, which is how does labour standards fit in these bilateral negotiations when you have negotiation with countries that are, in a sense, equal partners? The EU, and certainly in our interviews with people in the European Parliament, will keep on talking about the fact that labour standards is a core mandate issue. We cannot have a trade agreement without that on the table. And the Indians, for their part, are saying, well, no, this is an issue of sovereignty. We will not have a negotiation on any agreement that has this in there. So how do you then square that circle? How do you deal with those particular framing is sort of one of the stories we are bringing into it. Another one, there's another sub-project that's emerging, is working with a colleague here, Rory Horner, who will be doing some work with us around South-South trade in pharmaceuticals, and again looking at the ways in which labour standards and IPE issues are framed in the pharmaceutical sector in India. But that, in brief, is what our project is about.